I like that. I had to get a little sustenance. I was about to parched. Okay. I was looking through the little notes.
I want to be able to remember everything about a character study.
I never remember. I have to write that down. Okay, where are you at, Esther? There you are. Are you ready, Freddie? So you'll do this one, and I'll do this one this time. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Welcome to the Fullness of Joy podcast. I'm your host, Destiny.
And I'm your host, Mackenzie.
And on today's episode, we are going to be diving into just 2 characters of the Bible, Esther and Mordecai, and how we can apply what they ultimately have taught us through Scripture to our own lives.
So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite tea and sit with us in the presence of God for this next half hour or so as we experience His fullness of joy.
Awesome. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. So new day for you, same day for us.
Look at the clothing if you're on YouTube.
All right, Esther and Mordecai.
Yeah. You want to start?
I guess. So I think it's important to make the distinction that this is a historical narrative. And we're going to be looking at Esther. Esther is told from the perspective of Mordecai, right? Like Mordecai is the suspected author of the book of Esther. And Mordecai is the cousin of Esther. He basically raises her because she was an orphan. Is that the correct term that they use, is orphan?
Yeah.
Would that be the correct term?
She was without father and mother because they both passed away.
Yes, an orphan. So, I mean, that's the term we'll use. And so really her story kind of starts really young because, okay, when I think of Esther and Mordecai, I have that image from VeggieTales in my head. And I know that's not correct. Esther, I mean, number one, she was young. She would have been like, what, 12 to 15? Somewhere in that age range. And the events of this entire book are over the like a 10-year-ish period. So, because in my mind, when I read Esther, it's always like, okay, they had this dinner, this happened, she gets selected. Like, no, it's actually like, because I mean, she was in King Xerces, what do you call it, like harem for almost 4 or 5 years before she was even like picked.
Yeah.
So
they had to teach her how to be a lady, basically, and how to be proper and
like prepare her to go into his presence. So it's just a lot of stuff that I didn't know until studying to, relay this information for the podcast.
Yeah. Just the basis or the kind of the underlying facts that we need to know about the book of Esther is Esther is a Jewish maiden who became the Queen of Persia.
Yeah.
She rescued her people from a murderous plot. But her story begins with a king's banquet. And throughout this book, there's multiple banquets that is happening. And culturally, even today, Jews or the Jewish culture still celebrate banquets. And this banquet in particular, because it showed it was what relieved them from this assassination, basically. From the Hebrew name for Esther is Hadassah. Which I love that name. I don't know about you. I think it's so pretty.
It almost has like a little more oomph on it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense. But
yeah.
Like Hadassah.
Yeah.
Hadassah went into the presence of the king. I don't know. It just has
like
a little.
Miss Bot.
Yeah.
Miss Ma'am went in. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree.
But throughout this book, we're just able to see her faithfulness and her serving humbly before the Lord, even though God is not mentioned once.
Correct.
In this book. And that's the amazing thing about this.
That's what, skipping to 4:14 just really quickly, it says, who knows, perhaps you have come to your royal position for such time as this. And even if you're not like churched or have read the Bible a lot, you probably have. That's one of the verses that is very often quoted. I know I've seen it like on plaques and stuff. Like there's actually a church in town. They have it under their big clock as a reminder.
Have you seen that meme of like women's ministry of like them every time they do a book study on Esther, they like sit up properly and they're like, for a time such as this, we are all gathered here today. And I'm like, what in the world? But I want you to know this is not going to be like that.
No.
We just want to how we can apply it to our lives, and even take that simple statement of what Mordecai said to Esther of, like, because you're in this position, you're here to save the people. The same thing with Joseph. You know, it's a great reflection of Joseph. Joseph thrown into slavery, thrown into prison, but still became the second-hand man to Pharaoh and led the world to rescue, basically, from this famine that was destroying the lands. But not only that, in the very last chapter, he says, you guys intended this for evil, but God intended it for good. And I think that's that same mindset, perspective of, for such a time as this, is God's still using it for good, even though he's not even mentioned.
That's like, I love how people explain it, like God's not mentioned, but he was working behind the scenes. Like he was working to save his people who couldn't save themselves. So he used who he needed to use in order to make that happen.
Yeah. And when Mordecai went, or when, like, Esther told her people, like, go and ask Mordecai, like, why he's so distraught and stuff like that. And when she got word of, well, King Haman's about to mass murder our people, you know, our culture.
I'd be a little upset too.
And for King Xerces, or however you pronounce his name, and risked her life, you know, and that's because that's when she finally said, I'm a Jew, and he's about to kill, like, my people, basically. And she risked her life when approaching the king. But it's so important to know, like Mackenzie said, God was working in the background. God intervened when necessary, and when he intervened in this specific part of the book, he intervened, and the king was pleased to see her, and then put out his staff, which was, in that culture, was the acceptance of her presence, you know. And that's the beauty of it, of a king who's the father of this prince or this king or whatever, of Haman, was like, well, you're a Jew, but come on in, you know, like, come be with me, you know, come sit and chat.
His ego was kind of his demise.
Yeah.
So I guess that kind of, we need to dial it back. Like, okay, you're saying Haman, who, you know, people will be like, well, who is he? So, okay, we have King Xerxes. He's the big man, the top dog. So he has a wife, and I think I would love to know more about her. Like his wife, Vashti. He has her. He basically asks her, like, okay, I'm in the midst of my fellow dudes. Will you come in and entertain us?
Well, it was to wear a crown.
Yeah, but nothing. Like wear your crown. Again, it was kind of like this ego trip that he was on. But he wanted her to come in with just the crown. And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. So then the king is basically, he's so mad at her that I have not found if it's conclusive whether he had her killed or basically just like sent back into the harem.
Well, it was like, he just told her, like, get out of my presence. I never want to see you again. So it's like, from what I was studying, like, she just vanished. And stuff. And so no one saw her even, like, again.
In the harem, she just up and
I just saw, like, that she vanished.
Okay.
And stuff. And that's when they sent out, like, the bachelorette or the bachelor of, like, here's these 400 women who's going to take 4 to 5 years to prepare for you, king. But, like,
but the sad thing is they all were so young too. And he was old. He was like 40. And these girls are like 12 to 15. And so then over that 4-year period before he even picks Esther, he's basically
grooming them.
Yeah, grooming them, and basically defiles an entire generation of poor girls who then, obviously, once they have been with the king, there was no chance of them going back to anywhere, because we know that virtue of virginity was such an important.
And if you're not a believer who's listening to this and you're like, oh my goodness, why would a God let these bad things happen? It's history.
Right.
You know, in Egyptian history, there's rape, there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse. In the Chinese history, or like whatever politics or whatever culture we want to dive into, the same thing,
because humans were involved.
Yeah.
So thank goodness we have, you know, we can have the perspective of a God who came in and delivered.
It's the same thing. Like, let's go back to Pharaoh. God says to him, I could have just stretched out my hand and wiped you out completely of this earth. but because of my mercy, I'm going to continually invite you in. I'm going to continually give you that invitation to accept me and to repent. But he kept rejecting and dishonoring and disregarding him. You know, it's that same perspective of that God's has a purpose behind the pain, and that's to bring him glory and to bring worship to his name. Because he is in ultimate control. There's no other God. Or if we go back to last episode when we were talking about Psalm 16, there's no other God above our God. Like we can't even speak it upon our lips another God because we're doing just such a dishonorment to our God. Does that make sense? So,
So, okay, now we've got the King Xerces, Vashti. Okay, so now she's gone. So then Mordecai, how was he into this story?
He was like a high government official, and so he adopted Esther since she was without a parent. And
because Haman was like the king's right-hand man. He was even higher than Mordecai.
Well,
then Mordecai at the king's gate, I guess Haman comes through and basically Mordecai refuses to bow to him, and Haman gets a power trip, and from that he basically coerces there we go, the king into this plan of basically wiping out all Jews from that one action.
It's true. Like my favorite part of Esther is Esther 4:16 when she says, if I perish, I perish. Of if I have to die for my people, if I have to die for what I believe in, let it be. You know, she was like a martyr. You know, she was going to be martyred for her people and for her king, like her true king, for the sake of her people, because it's important that Esther was put in that position, not for the sake of Israel or the Hebrews, but for the sake of God, you know, to bring about, like we said, glory and worship to his name, but also the deliverance of his people once again, because that's what God is always doing in history, and especially during the Old Testament. He is constantly delivering his people. Yes, it's going to take plagues. Yes, it's going to take 400 years in slavery. But it's all about the mercy, the true mercy, how he's rich in mercy to come to that like conclusion. You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it's almost like that's parallel in Esther having the multiple banquets. She's like giving the king these chances to almost like gauge her character. I would think, like saying, okay, come to this banquet tonight. Now let's have another banquet. Or, you know, who knows what the timeline was. Well, were the banquets directly one after the other?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. So I would have to sit here and read that to be 100%. But, you know, it's like that. It's almost like mirrored in that, how it's like these multiple times.
And I think it's mirrored with Joseph too, who's a great example of Christ in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis of he sees his brothers. He doesn't tell him that he's Joseph, the one that they threw into slavery. They send him home. They send the brothers home because the whole purpose of Joseph was to make sure that they received God and that they were completely restored in their relationship with Joseph, but ultimately their relationship with God. And I think that's what the same thing Esther's trying to do. And with what you said is she's trying to restore her people to this kingdom, basically, but also restore the king and his people to God, which is Yahweh.
Yes. So we see the banquets, and ultimately through the banquets, Esther is able to reveal this plot that Haman has, in that if he sends out this decree to kill the Jews, that will include her because she herself is Jewish. And so at that point, the king is like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Well, it's important to know that he was with it. Like, he agreed with Haman, like, let's kill him. And then he was sitting in bed one day, and he had one of his slaves or one of his people reading one of the king's chronicles. And in it was when Mordecai saved the king from an assassination from these this other people group.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that
and
up.
the king was like, we never gave him anything. Like, we never did anything for him. And so the king, Xerces, sparing Mordecai's life was just an example of...
So something that happened way back when ended up playing a crucial, like, it's almost again that parallel for such a time as this. Well, his time was that instance, and
just God intervening when needed.
So Haman, he takes a garment. He took the garment and the horse. He clothed Mordecai and then paraded him through the city square, calling out before him, "This is what is done for the man the king wants to honor." How mad! I mean, we know, because then Haman goes home and basically tells his wife, like, "You're never gonna believe what happened at work today." You know,
that's funny. Yeah.
So I bet he was like fuming, so mad.
Yeah. But it was just good humility, you know? It was good practice to be humbled before a lower servant. Yeah. But I think one of the things that stands out to me the most about Esther, or just her character, because it's a character study, was her bravery and her faith, and how big of a testament that was to her trust in the God of the Hebrews, basically, of if I perish, I perish, you know, and that's
intense. Yeah. Because, like, words really meant something. You know what I mean? So for her to declare that and to just be all in.
Yeah, because Mordecai had to, like, tell her, because she was that only godly figure in her life, you know, of, like, that manly godly figure, like that fatherly figure in her life. And he was like, you were put into this position for a reason. And because you're in this position, it could be for for the deliverance of the people of the Hebrew nation, you know, and it took her a minute to truly understand that commitment. And so when she took herself before the king, that showed bravery.
I don't think it's recording.
Oh.
How much battery do we have left?
10%.
Oh no, okay, hurry.
So we're good. Still recording.
Okay, we're gonna wrap this up.
We only got 10% left.
Okay, hurry.
Go ahead. But yeah, a time will come where I think, like, when we will be in a certain place, experience, or meet people, that everything comes together, and we can just look back and realize we were in the right place at the right time.
Yes.
And how Esther trusted in God and humbly served him no matter the cost is how we should live.
Right. So to quickly sum up what happens in Esther, so Haman has to parade Mordecai around, then they have the other banquet, and then the king's like, "Okay, Esther, is there anything you want? Like, let me know and I'll do it." And she's like, "If I have found favor with you," and she basically tells him, like, "Hey, there's this plot happening, and the adversary, the enemy, is this evil Haman," in verse 6 in chapter 7. And so then the king is like, "Hold up, what's happening?" Haman is executed, and essentially Esther intervenes for the Jews and saves the Jews from this mass genocide. And just something really quick that I wanted to point out from this that we had talked about, the practical application that I see from this that I feel like is really important to share, kind of goes back to your testimony episode in episode 1. So how can we relate to Esther? Well, I would think as Esther, as a young girl, she's probably getting frustrated over all these decisions that are being made that seem out of her control. And I felt like that was kind of a callback to how we talked about you being, you know, and even me living at home with parents who were not Christians. That definitely that would be a situation where decisions are made that are out of your control that you may be frustrated with. And we can see here that Esther's character and her testimony was that she trusted God to use her in his time. And I think that's an example for us that, you know, you're going through something that you can't control, but trust God that whatever's going on, he will use your suffering or your situation for a purpose, but it will be in his time. So don't get frustrated. Don't pull away or become distant because you don't see anything happening. Know that for such a time as this, God will intervene, and that timing we may not understand or see, but it will come. And we may not even see the fruits of, you know, us being faithful in a situation where others are not, and they're making decisions that are contrary to our belief, but there still can be that seed that's planted that will come to fruition at a later time.
And even just taking what we can learn from Mordecai, his integrity put him at a good stance with the Lord.
Yes, his integrity.
Or with the Lord and with the earthly king, you know, and his concern for the Jewish people ultimately brought the blessing of God upon them.
Right.
You know, and when we stand firm in what we believe in and we don't bow down to the earthly kings around us, God blesses that. God honors that. and he sees it. And so the same way that Esther is faithful and brave, the same way Mordecai is faithful and full of integrity. Right. And that's how we should live, is that our actions should follow up with what we believe in. Yep. And we should go out into this world boldly and with abundance of courage to speak against what culture is ultimately pounding against us.
So we can just really know, like, he is at work, whether we realize it or not. And we can have the opportunity to look for him and be willing to move or to do or go when he says it's time. Yeah. All right, so
that's a wrap on today's episode.
Join us next week as we jump into the topic chosen by you.
And we look forward to sharing with you as we begin this journey of proclaiming the good news of Christ by equipping, educating, and engaging you in your desire to better understand God and his word.
So until next time, remain in joy, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
We just made it by the skin of our teeth.